At API Days Singapore 2026, AI was certainly a big topic. And one of the highlights of the conference was Sutowo Wong. He's at Temus. He was previously at the Singapore's Ministry of Health. And this is the second time that Sutowo has spoken at API Days Singapore. I'd like to welcome Sutowo.
Thanks, John.
So, Sutowo, you've had a bit of a background in data and analytics, and your previous role was focused specifically on healthcare. But can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you are and the path that took you here?
So I was really looking at how to expand and broaden my impact as much as I enjoy the work in healthcare, because I think there's still so much to learn after spending about 10 years in healthcare. It is very deep and very enriching as a sector. I find that there are many more opportunities to actually bring what I have done over to the other sectors. And that was quite evident when I was in healthcare and I was asked to do quite a fair bit of sharing. And the feedback given to me by many of the people whom I have met, I've done the sharing with, they actually came back to me and say that they found the sharing to be useful and is relevant to them, despite the differences in sector. So I find that there's actually a lot of demand out there for what we have been doing in healthcare. So that's one thing. The second thing, why Temus? Temus to me is still very much an extension of the work that I do in the public service in Singapore. It is fully owned by Temasek, which is our sovereign wealth fund. The work cuts across both public and private sector. Today, a slight majority of the work is in the public sector. We are now growing the private sector a bit with heavier emphasis on the Temasek portfolio companies. So I find that the ability to actually look across both public and private sector is actually a very interesting proposition, because I do think that the focus is quite different. On the private sector end, it's really about ROI, revenue uplift, cost reduction. On the public sector side, there are a lot more nuance in terms of the type of objectives. For example, in a private sector, you wouldn't want to target the hard-to-reach customer, right? They're not going to bring you too much revenue or money. But in the public sector, that's precisely the type of target audience you're going after. The hard-to-reach people who are actually vulnerable. This is the target audience for you. In fact, this is the priority target audience. And therefore, you can't say that because they are very hard to reach, let's ignore them. You can't ignore them. So the nature of work can be quite different. Objectives can be quite different. And I find that it's very interesting. And actually, both sides can learn from one another. And sitting in Temus allows me the opportunity to be able to bring learnings across the two sectors.
You also had a chance, not just in terms of the organizational objectives, but also some of the techniques and practices that are used across different sectors. So how well do you feel that your expertise in healthcare analytics has transferred across to the different sectors? What are some of the things that you feel are the similar or the same?
Yeah. Let me start with the parts that are similar. The good thing about healthcare is that it is very rich in data, and at the same time, we are suffering from quite a number of challenges around, for example, fragmentation of data, inconsistencies around the codes being used, the definition, right? Not that people are intentionally trying to be different, but rather because of operational needs are different across different healthcare institutions, and as a result, they have made different decisions around how they want to define their data, what kind of codes they want to use. Some could be legacy decisions that was made in the past, right? And as a result, if you want to look at the data holistically across the nation, there's a lot of harmonization of data that needs to be done. And healthcare being a very sensitive, I would say, topic to many people, means then that the data itself is actually just as sensitive. And therefore, the safeguards that we put around the protection of data, the proper use of data, how do you govern who has access to what kind of data and for what purposes, actually works quite well also across many other sectors, especially the ones that are highly regulated. So think of financial services, think of security. A lot of this same mindset and philosophies around how we deal with data actually is quite transferable. Last but not least, is really also about the value that you are creating, right? Regardless of the sector, it's really about what effort are you putting into this initiative and what kind of value are you getting. As we discussed earlier, the way we define value can be different, but the fact that it has to create real sustainable value that moves the needle doesn't change just because you move from one sector to another. Coming to your second question on what's different, I think what's different really is if you look at the sector, it is a sector that is quite focused on individuals. So if you look at the clinicians, right, who is at the heart of healthcare, they are all trained to focus on the patient in front of them. And it's a one-to-one. It's always very focused on the individual. But when you look at data, when you look at AI, analytics, you have to look at things at a system level. And that in itself is quite interesting because you talk to the clinicians who are so dedicated and focused and passionate about patient care, one-to-one patient care. At the same time, you know that there are things that you need to do at the system level, and you have to try to bridge the gap. Of course, you can find also many clinicians who actually love to look at things at the system level as well. But at the same time, you also have clinicians who are still very much focused on the one-to-one. And being able to bridge the gap between one-to-one at the patient level and what you do at the system level is absolutely critical for success in healthcare. That may not necessarily be true in every other sector, and therefore I find that that is the part that quite unique about healthcare that we are seeing. Right? And it is also quite a high touch sector because of the nature of it. People who actually go to a healthcare institution tend to be already feeling quite lost sometimes because they may not have access to a lot of the information that the clinician has. There's a great asymmetry in terms of the information, and the caregiver sometimes may not know any better as well, and they are equally anxious when they go to a healthcare institution. And therefore, it is actually a place that requires very high touch, empathy. That human touch is actually very important. Again, that may not be the same across all the sectors. Some sectors are designed to be high throughput, moving very quickly without a lot of human connection and not generally more low touch. So that's another area that I thought is quite different between healthcare and other sectors.
So in terms of AI and the objectives, in your talk you mentioned the AI triangle. Do you want to just walk through why you have that framework and what it brings to help you succeed in an AI initiative?
Yep. So the AI triangle has three parts to it. One is that has to be solved for simultaneously, right? Having just one or two out of the three is not going to result in a successful AI transformation. First is that it has to be transformative, right? And going back to the point about value earlier, how does the AI transformation lead to measurable outcomes that move the needle? That came from my experience seeing many organizations, including those in healthcare, where we embark on many proof of concepts or POCs. Often that it's done in a standalone environment because you want to prove the technology works, especially in healthcare where you are actually dealing with people's lives and lives are at stake. You have to be extremely careful, and therefore you do a lot of testing and proof of concepts in very isolated environment before you actually bring it to production and live environment. So there are many of these that are going on. And at the same time, people do not know what others are actually experimenting in their POCs or pilots. And because you do not see it, you do not know what's happening on the other side, you tend to then do and repeat whatever others are doing. And you see many POCs across that doesn't really scale. Part of the reason is also as they start the POC, because it is in a standalone environment, they may not have necessarily brought all the key stakeholders, because for any AI, analytics, or data initiative in healthcare, for that matter, any technology initiatives in healthcare, you have to bring a few key stakeholders together. One is definitely the clinicians who actually wants to use it for the patient care. And they have to find it useful, and you cannot make them toggle across many different applications because they have only that short time that they have with the patient. And you have to make their life easy. You have to make it efficient for them. The second group is the administrators. You want to be able to tap on or have a view of the workflow. How do you organize the workforce? How do you make sure that the whole workflow is actually streamlined and you get the administrative support necessary, funding support necessary to get the initiatives going? And the last group is the technologists. You need the people who knows the architecture, the infrastructure, and they know the governance rules around IT, around data security. And only when you have these three groups coming together, that's where you have successful project. And because people are doing a POC in a standalone environment, they tend to neglect either one or maybe even two out of the three stakeholder group. They may just work with the stakeholder clinicians, for example, wanting to make sure that it's being adopted in clinical care. But they forget that later on, as you do the scaling, you need funding to actually do integration, to do many things. And to do integration, you need to go back to the technologies and go through with them whether or not whatever solution that you build at POC actually conforms to the governance requirement. Often it is not. So you end up having to abort and change many of the things that was built during the POC stage, which is not very encouraging and it is not very productive. And sometimes people just give up and they don't continue from POC. So I see a lot of this happening, and it's not just in healthcare, it's across many different sectors as well, because I have friends from other sectors who are telling me similar things. And therefore, one of the theses that we have is that for AI transformation to work, it has to be actually transformative, it has to achieve measurable outcome, and that means we cannot stop at POC. We have to bring it to production, we have to integrate with the other systems, we have to actually reimagine the workflow, sometimes if necessary, changing the job role that individuals who are involved in that particular workflow has to perform. So that's the transformative bit. The second part is around sovereignty. There's often that fear and concern that the data gets leaked as you use, for example, the LLMs, because many of them are via API calls. You may have to send data across to their server, and the server often sits somewhere else. It's not even in Singapore. Let's not talk about whether that server is controlled by you as an organization. So there's a lot of fear around sovereignty on data, and there are some arrangements that are made, for example, arrangements made in the form of a commercial contract with the Frontier AI Labs where they agree not to use the data from you for training their LLM. They agree to not logging the prompts that you use and the results that you get from your prompts, so that then you don't have the fear that they're actually keeping a lot of these things in their server. But that can only work to a certain extent because there will be certain type of data that's highly confidential, sometimes even secret in terms of the classification, at least within the public service. Such commercial arrangement will not be sufficient or adequate for you to actually put your mind at ease when it comes to the protection of the data. And you want to be able to control it. So that's one thing about the data. Second part is contextualization to the organizational realities, right? It can be in a few ways. One is around contextualization to the architecture, because almost all organizations, maybe except if you're starting a company from scratch, will have to then deal with whatever existing infrastructure that they have, existing investments that they have made, or in-flight investments that have been approved, not yet executed. So these are realities, and therefore being able to contextualize the project or the AI model or AI solution to the reality of the architecture and infrastructure that it is going to sit on is very important. Of course, then the business context to it, what's important to the business, what are the priorities, how is the workflow like, how ready are the stakeholders, all this are part of the sovereignty, because if the people are not ready, you are not actually ready to take advantage of AI, and it's not sovereign to you because it is imposed upon you and you are not able to carry on later on your own. Last but not least is speed. Gone are the days where we can spend years on transformation project within an organization. And we do see an AI paradox, right? If you look at the value that could have been created by AI because of the technological advancement and the capabilities that are available, the value would have been so much higher compared to the actual realized business value. And there is a value gap that we are seeing, and it is actually a large number. And that gap is created as a result of a tempo mismatch. Because if you look at how fast the AI models are coming out in terms of the breakthroughs, new releases, it actually happens every few months. And yet enterprise deployment cycles are usually measured in years. And that disconnect in terms of the tempo is one of the reasons why many of the initiatives are actually not successful. And there's a lot of money on the table, so to speak, and that value gap can only be closed if we can move at speed. And what do I mean by speed? Right? To give you a sense, the team that I have now can do a prototype in 6 hours, and the deployment can be done in sometimes as short as 6 weeks, if not no more than 12 weeks, depending on the complexity of the use case, the complexity of the integration that is needed, how ready the infrastructure on the client side. So if you put all these things together, it has to be transformative, it has to be sovereign to you, it has to move at speed. And when you are able to achieve all three, that's where we see the most successful AI transformation.
Thanks for framing that. I guess what that means is that a lot of things that are going to cross your desk or cross an organization's desk are not going to satisfy all three of those constraints in the framework. So, but this can be a challenge to identify very early on, because the key to gaining some momentum is to start small, do something simple, get a quick win, get some runs on the board. But that necessarily means you need to ignore some things that will take a longer time or require more investment to satisfy. At the same time as you're starting small, particularly in the technology world, we have this concept of shift left. You should be thinking about security early on. You should be thinking about the sustainability of the software pipeline early on. But if you address all of those things, then very early on in an initiative, you end up having a meeting with 20 or 30 people in it, and that's not starting small. So you've got this inherent to wanting to start something and gather momentum, and making sure that you're doing things right within a security standpoint, a governance standpoint. So what are the things that you've learned about getting that mix right?
Yeah. So you are absolutely spot on, because that is the kind of tension and the trade-off that often one has to make when we actually look at the different use cases. There are a few ways for us to look at how to address that. One is it is our belief that AI will have to be driven by the CEO. You can have the chief AI officer, but the person actually driving AI transformation at the organizational level will have to be the CEO. Now, why is that so? Because often if you have the chief AI officer, he or she will only take care of perhaps the team of the AI scientists or AI engineers, maybe with that a group of data engineers as well. But to achieve that transformation, you can't just have engineering talent. You need to reimagine your workflow. You need to redesign your job role, right? Workflow requires the different business unit leads who reports to the CEO. They don't report to the chief AI officer. So if they are not reporting to the chief AI officer, there's no lever that the AI officer has over the BU leads. So that's one part about the workflow. The second part is about the job role. Because if you really want to truly get value out of AI, you need to deconstruct your workflow into three buckets. One is work that is done, or task that is done entirely by AI and can be done autonomously without human involvement. Tasks that are done by human without any support or help from AI. And then there are tasks that are done by human but assisted by AI. And it's only when you have deconstructed that workflow into the three buckets and then you reconstruct them, you can then start to form workflows that are end-to-end autonomously done by AI. There are those done by human. And if you do any change effort, any enablement and training, you can then focus on the third bucket, right? Those that are done by human but assisted by AI. And that will inevitably involve changes in someone's job role. And if HR is not in there, it's not in the conversation, there's no way this can move. Which is why if you can achieve that alignment, if you target the CEO and the CEO say, yes, I'm going to lead this transformation, the chances of success is a lot higher than if it is just delegated to the chief AI officer. So these, to me, are ways for us to achieve alignment at an organizational level. And therefore, with that alignment, even if you have to work with multiple stakeholders, they know the CEO is watching, they know the CEO wants to know the progress and is chasing for outcome and the progress. People will move at higher speed. And that's what I'm seeing in many organizations.
I guess that reinforces the recognition that technology-enabled change isn't something that can be done to people. It has to be done with people. So it's not just the technical people who are enacting the change. It is everyone who is involved in the delivery of a function needs to be open to the possibilities of this change, and you need to address concerns that those people have. Am I going to be replaced by this machine? Am I going to be de-skilled? So I no longer use my expertise, but I'm just pushing some buttons on something, and I don't get as much satisfaction or value out of the work itself than I did before. So you're right to point out that there is a lot of change management involved in introducing any improvement to that. Are there any other things you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think another part that's often neglected is around governance. A lot of people see governance as speed bumps, and you are trying to move fast and governance actually slows you down. But in my view, it's actually not necessarily the case. Often what slows people down is not the fact that there's governance, but it's because of the lack of clarity in governance. And therefore, it's important for everyone to be clear about what is allowed, what is not allowed. And that clarity itself can be very liberating. And that's when people know how they can push the limit and move very fast. Think of it as having a brake in the car, right? When you're driving, you're not likely to drive very fast if you know that there's no brake. But when you know that there's a brake, and you know that if something goes wrong or about to go wrong, you can stop the car, are more willing to move faster. And to me, AI governance or data governance or more broadly governance in itself actually is an accelerator. It is not actually a speed bump. And the key is having clarity. And most often that part is missing in many organizations. And I think if I can leave one more thought with the audience, really about governance, it shouldn't be seen as something that is slowing you down. The second thing about governance is that it shouldn't be slapped on at the end as another additional layer on top of your, say, technology solution. It should be actually baked into the design, baked into the architecture to be effective. Because otherwise, if it's slapped on at the end, most often it is not sufficient. It is actually not very useful. So something to think about as people get into AI projects, AI transformation, AI use cases. Think about governance, and hopefully what I'm sharing here can help the audience see governance in a different way.
Well, thanks, Sutowo. That's been quite refreshing and enlightening. I appreciate you sharing your perspective and your expertise. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jon.